Welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast. I'm Greg Burke, and now in my 24th year as Director of Athletics at Northwestern State University. Creating an environment in which student athletes and young professionals can develop skill sets to make them successful in any walk of life is invaluable. Mentors can provide an extra measure of confidence by helping them grow, by seeking their input, and by listening to their ideas. This and much more can be found in Will Baggett and Ty Brown's book, The Blueprint for a Successful Career, a foundation for developing young professionals. Find it on Amazon.
Greetings, this is Ty Brown and welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast, where we highlight executive and organizational leadership. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at 1Q Leadership. Our guest today is Dr. Eric Laudano. Eric is the Senior Associate Athletics Director for High Performance at St. Joseph's University. Greetings, Eric. I'm glad to have you on the podcast again.
Thank you, Ty. Great to be here again.
Now, of course, Eric, last time we talked, we were talking about the position you are in there, and I had both you and Jill on talking about why that position was important in terms of being a centrally located leader to talk about student athlete health and well-being. And since we recorded that, I've got to know you a little bit. We were at the Sloan Sports Analytics Conference, and it's interesting to me when you have somebody like that on campus, how useful you are, and you sometimes can even be useful outside of athletics. And one of the things we're talking about, the minute we left that Sloan conference, you know, the world is hit with the global pandemic, right? Which is crazy. And so here we are a few months down the line and people are talking about going back to campus. And I imagine that campuses, as well as people in athletics, are working on some type of plan for coming back to campus for student athletes, for the staff, for coaches, and everything like that. You mentioned to me a couple of days ago that you're working on what's called a return to activity plan. And I wonder what goes into putting something like that together. Is it a document? Is it a whole strategy? Are you working with campus? Is it living and breathing? Does it have a period at the end? Like, talk to me about the return to activity plan that you're working on there at St. Joseph's.
Yeah, well, if I can reflect back to the Sloan conference we were at, I think that was the beginning of the COVID-19 kind of start of everything. And it seems so long ago, and we were having conversations back then about what this may look like in the future. And if I look back, it looks like the future is now. And so, as you stated, last time we were on, Jill and I were talking about my position and the needs of the position and why it was necessary and how common it's become in college athletics. And I think, one of the main responsibilities of this position is to lead in such a time like this. And it's important to be lockstep with the director of athletics and others on campus. And so really what we've put together is a plan for return to activity. And a lot goes into putting the plan together. And really when I started this plan, I took ownership in making sure that I was leading the department with this plan while also collaborating with Jill, our athletic director, other members of the athletics department, the executive team, and then also folks on campus, which include our vice president for student life, our student health director, housing, campus safety, working really closely with our team physicians and talking to them on a very steady basis. And this plan really, although not finalized yet, and probably not too different than what other athletic departments are doing across the country, this is a living, breathing document. It will continue to be a living, breathing document as things change, both related to the virus itself, based off of CDC recommendations, based off of government guidelines, based off of NCAA best practices and recommendations and rules. And so I think, we're at kind of the final stages of putting it together, although it's not finalized. We ironically just had a phone call prior to this call, myself and Jill and members of the executive team with members of campus, just to talk through scenario planning, talk through dates that we have in mind, but we haven't already solidified, just to educate the campus as to what's happening in athletics and where we are in our process with this document so that they have input, but also they can support us. And also we can have communication back and forth onto what's prudent, what makes sense, and what's safe without rushing this.
Right. Well, I wonder if you would educate me after you put a title on the top of the page, return to activity plan, right? Mm-hmm. Tell me where you start. Like, tell me where it goes when you put your first piece of information on the document or in the plan. And of course, there are meetings, and I mean, it probably grows thousand bullet points and sub bullet points and
Yeah.
Roman numeral A. I mean, one. I mean, just tell me about exactly what's on there, and from start to finish, or to where you are now. Like, what did you include, and how did you come to decisions to include those things? The whole process, right?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So it's literally how I started, with a blank Google Doc. And I put the title up there, and I titled it, I think my original title was Athletics Activity Resumption Process. And then I probably have had multiple revisions since then.
Right.
But really, when I started this, at first I was like, wow, this is a lot. Like, I have a lot to do, and I got to get this out there, and I got to make sure I get it right. Then after a few minutes, I go and I reflect, and I say, well, no one's perfect, and no one's gone through this before. We're all in this boat together, and there's really no quote manual of how to do this. And so that kind of settled my mind. And then I went back and I really looked at what was currently out there when I started this. I probably started this about a month, maybe a month and a half ago. And I took, I read a lot. I did research on what was out there from Olympic organizations or professional organizations, or the White House resumption of activities, reopening America again. And so I looked at industry specific documents that were out there. I looked at government documents that were out there. And then, frankly, you tap into your network in college athletics, and this is never a better time to tap into the network of what others are doing. And so kind of got on the phone with some networks and some friends, and just note shared as to how they're building it, what they're building, and what they're putting in it. Then once I felt good in that, I kind of settled back, and I remember the moment when I said, what questions are people going to want to know? What are the student athletes going to want to know? What do the parents want to know? What do the sport administrators and coaches want to know? What does campus need to know so that they can support us? And so that's how I started building this document. It started off as like my own FAQ. And so I also had a vision in my mind of the student athletes coming from the locations where they are now across the country or across the globe. And what does that process look like as they get closer and closer to Hagan Arena and St. Joseph's University's athletics facilities? And that really helped me structure the information. So it's, really, what's the education? I think that's the proactive part. What do the student athletes need to be educated on? What do they need to know that's going to happen when they come to campus? What are the expectations that we have of them, and what should they have of us? What's in place for us to be safe and for them to be safe? What's the process every single day when they eventually return back to in person to activities? And then I just took it as a stepwise progression in terms of, if anyone tests positive, what's that process? What's the process for managing anyone who tests positive? What's the process to return after a positive? And how are we going to keep this process going to make sure that our athletes are safe? And at the end of the day, it's all about athlete safety, and we're not rushing this process just to bring people back. We want people to come back at the right time where everyone is safe, so that we have a really great system in place so that the athletes can feel really taken care of when they come back.
As you were describing that, in my mind, I was thinking about like thought flow charts, right? If this, then this, and under there's a if this and a line going to this, and like you start getting into a whole spider web, and the document just gets wider and wider and wider, and
right
now you got to include a bunch of people from around campus. Tell me about the communication. You mentioned it earlier, but about the who specific was key as you've been building it together to communicate with on campus and really in athletics.
Yeah, I mean, we have a great working group. I will say that we have myself, our athletic director, vice president of student life, vice president of facilities, student health nurse, and student health physician, our team physicians, our housing director, our international student office, our compliance officer, our head athletic trainer, my entire team. There's a lot of people that are part of this working group. And then if the group needs a specific topic to talk about, we'll also bring other folks in on campus that, have that area content expert background to make sure that they're involved and we're thinking of everything. So as the group started, it always evolves into more and more people. And I think it always should, because I think a lot of people need to be educated, but also the campus needs to know and understand what's happening out there. So it's an educational perspective, but it's also a two-way communication and conversation that's always happening.
Is there an aspect of there's an area that is a branch off of one of the categories sub bullet point or something, right? Is there an aspect of, well, I use the term area content expert. I've heard you use that a lot. So is there an aspect of, well, this is something that, Linda over here is an expert. So these are the questions we need answered. She'll answer them, get them back to me, and then I'll put them on the document. Like, are you like just the facilitator of everything, or talk to me about that process of actually receiving the input and building this return activity plan?
So I think a perfect example of that would be our housing staff on campus. If and when we bring student athletes back to campus and they need a place to stay and we need to isolate them, what's the optimal dorm? What rooms are available? How are we managing laundry facilities in the dorm, for example? What resources are available from student life and from housing? What's happening with campus dining, on-campus dining? How are we making sure they're being fed the safe way through grab and goes or through single wrapped individual foods? So I think that's an example of kind of the campus experts that we bring in when we need to know how things may potentially unfold or need to unfold, and how the university can support us. And we also need to know, what is the university able to do? We don't want the university to think that we are kind of going off on our own. We want them as partners. So we need to know what's available and what's not available. And I think that's one perfect example of that.
Right. And then when you talk about internally in athletics, talking to coaches and talking to those type of folks, tell me about the information gathered from coaches or information provided to coaches as you put this together.
Yeah, I mean, our coaches have been exceptional through this whole process, understanding and patient and really following our lead and asking the appropriate questions at the appropriate time. I think, we provide the information to them as we get the information. As the information is fluid from everywhere every day. Something may potentially change. And so we try to communicate as quickly and as openly as we can. And we also provide an opportunity for our coaches to ask any questions, to be sure that they're equipped with the information in case a student athlete or parent reaches out to them or recruit reaches out to them. And so the dynamic that we have with our coaches related to this and the resumption of activity, and the reality is that it's not going to look normal when we come back. And just saying it's not going to look normal is not enough. And so it's important to educate what that means. In the beginning, it may look like a smaller amount of student athletes and a limited space with the physical distancing requirements, all the standards that everyone is working through and everyone knows about. And then as this evolves, or as potentially a vaccine evolves or something else comes out so that everyone can feel safer and can be healthier, I think that's when we go into the phases of like, how do we increase and ramp back up to what quote normal used to look like? So, the communication is the key part in all of this. And at the end, when this document that we're working on is finalized and this plan is ready to go, I mean, we're very transparent. So we don't have a problem sharing this with our coaches and our internal people as to what this looks like and what's involved in it.
Right. I have a couple more questions here, then we'll wrap. The first question is challenges. Nothing is perfect ever. And when you're working on something, something's going to happen. Right. And so talk to me about the challenges in putting something like this together. Right. I imagine trying to figure out what's going on with the virus in the next 3 weeks to 2 months is probably a big challenge. But as you put it together, what type of maybe snags or what have you found difficult to overcome, and you've had to overcome, because that's, obviously that's what you're hired for. So talk to me a little bit about the challenges in putting this together.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges is just potentially overthinking, right? I mean, it's like you want to make sure that you're capturing everything to include into this plan so you don't forget anything. And then sometimes when these plans are put together, you start to overthink. So that's been a challenge for me personally. I've just had to step back from the document literally and go do something else so that my brain can reset and I can come back and be refreshed. I think, another challenge is, as you stated, keeping up with the evolving news related to the virus itself, but also to what's happening from the NCAA level and the conference level, and then obviously the institutional level, and then paying attention to the government guidelines, both, nationally and then state, local, and county. Is not that it's a challenge. It's just a lot to make sure that you stay on top of, which is a global challenge, right? And then as we get that information, I populate it into this plan and I try and put it into correct either phase or under the correct question or correct header so that it's not confusing. And so what I also want to make sure is that this plan doesn't look like it's so long and long-winded that no one reads it or no one can understand it. So that's also the challenge, to make it direct and succinct too, so it can be followed the way it needs to be followed.
Yeah, that's important. And you mentioned earlier about when this is finalized, but you've also mentioned that it's a living and breathing document. How do you know when to say,
Right.
Jill, this is what we have? Like, let's move forward. Like, at what point? Because obviously, it seems like information will keep coming. Like you said, overthinking. You will keep looking at things and say, well, maybe this process can be tweaked a little bit. Like, how will you know when you're ready to move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm there now, to be candid, as at this date and time. Innately, I have an intuitive kind of feeling that I get when it's like, okay, like the news has slowed down a little bit potentially, and things are looking a bit more optimistic, and people are ready, and that's when I kind of feel like it's nearing its end. Then it's time to share that with the appropriate people and the appropriate sign-offs by legal team, and there will be feedback that comes back to make sure that we are in line with everything. And then I think once the reviews happen internally and we get kind of feedback from legal counsel and others, that's where I feel like it's almost at the 99.9% finalization phase, knowing it's never final. Then from there, as we get more information from government, CDC, NCAA, et cetera, and we need to add something, then that's the time where, in my mind, I feel like that's where we're in the continual editing form as things evolve, knowing that everyone knows it's never final.
Right, exactly. Everybody understands that. Essentially, though, I guess wrapping up here, you are creating something that will be the playbook for when student athletes return to campus, when they return to facilities, when they return to practice, and all those things. And it is a reference book for people to refer to. Hey, this is how we say we're going to handle it. Let's do it, execute. Everybody's on the same page. Let's go. Is that correct?
100%. It's that, but it's also all the way on the front end of the process as well, right? Like, here's what we have in place. Here's what's going to happen. Here's the expectations. Here's what we've outlined. We work through it when activity resumes. And then to your point this is going to be our reference to make sure we're staying on top of this. This doesn't get ahead of us, and that we always have something to go back to make sure that we're staying true to what we put together, to make sure everything is safe for our student athletes and our staff.
All right. Well, Eric, this has been an excellent conversation, very educational for me. Hopefully people listening kind of get a look into the process of creating something like what you're creating there at St. Joseph's. So I really appreciate you joining us here on One Question.
Great. Well, thanks for having me again. Always a pleasure to talk to you, Ty.
That was Dr. Eric Laudano. He is the Senior Associate Athletics Director for High Performance at St. Joseph's University. And of course, this is Ty Brown with One Question. And keep in mind, the role of a leader is to create and maintain an environment that people want to be a part of. And as always, be better tomorrow than you are today. This episode of the One Question Leadership Podcast is produced by Spades Media Group, solving problems using creative leadership.